what we're going to talk about today, obviously, is the State of Working India report. And if anybody in the audience doesn't know, I think to my knowledge, it is the most comprehensive and very detailed analysis of the employment situation in India. And we are very lucky to be talking to one of its principal authors, Professor Rosa Abraham, from the Center of Sustainable Employment at Azim Premji University. Professor Abraham, I just want to start with asking that this is the fourth edition of the report, and the theme that you've explored in this edition is of social identities and labor market outcomes. Just to start, I want to understand what does that mean, in first and foremost, and what made you and the team want to explore this particular theme in this edition of the report?
Yeah. So in terms of what it means, basically what we are looking at is really the social identities of gender, caste, and religion. So we wanted to see how these particular aspects played out in terms of who gets to do what, right? So if you remember our first State of Working India 2018, we had these, I think, 3 or 4 broad chapters of where is the work, what is the work, how good is the work, and then we also had this last chapter on who does the work. So coming to the question of why and what kind of provoked us to do this, I think as we've been doing that chapter and also with our work in the center, and I think this is also very it's a stylized fact of the Indian economy that things play out very differently for different groups of people. So these kind of identities have a huge role to play, and I think we felt that it was important for us to see while we do have the SWI looking at big picture stories and giving a comprehensive overview of the labor market, how are these social identities kind of filtering access and the kind of work that people do? So we were obviously all of us here at the center were very keen on doing something on those lines. And in fact, actually, this report was supposed to have been our SWI 2020 report, not a 2021 report. So we had started working on it by the end of 2019 or to 2020. I mean, beginning of 2020, we had started working on it. And then we all know what happened.
Yeah.
So COVID happened, and obviously the focus had to shift. And it was also important for us to take stock of what that was doing,
True.
which then led to State of Working India 2021. So this has been in the works for a while, honestly. It's sort of 3 years in the 2 to 3 years in the making. And it's taken various shapes because of the post-pandemic effect and how it also affected some of our work on the ground. So what you see really is the culmination of all of that.
And the amount of detail that has gone into all of this, and as I just want to delve into that. You mentioned who does what. So just to in a very broad way, just to talk about, we're talking about social identities, like you mentioned, of gender, caste, and religion, and of course the various intersections of these three identities. And on the other side, you investigate the relations between these identities and the kind of work that is available in the country, whether it's casual wage work, it's regular, it's self-employment. And then further, there are the sectors of the economy that provide this kind of employment: agriculture, industry, services, etc. So with that sort of framework, a broad framework in mind, in very broad terms, if it's possible to generalize, what can we say about who is doing what kind of work in the Indian economy?
Yeah, I mean, I think to answer this, it's nice to kind of use a sort of temporal lens and kind of
Yes.
zoom out into a big picture. What
Yes.
is the long story?
True.
And there's good news there, really. I mean, so ideally, what is it that we would want? We would want that what a person does is more or less independent of what their parents did, what their father did, right? So the question of who is your father and what does he do should have less and less of a role to play in what that person is doing.
True.
And so there are ways to look at this, and we kind of have this intergenerational mobility that we look at. So in households with fathers and sons, what is the kind of relation with father's employment and son's employment?
Yes.
So, for example, this thing, what we found is that in 2014 or 2004, for instance, when you look at it, 80% of sons of casual labor fathers were also casual workers themselves.
Yep.
There was a very high correlation in what between this. father-child occupations.
Hmm.
But by 2018-19, you have this kind of stickiness in a sense, weakening.
Hmm.
And so most of the children of casual wage workers, a large share, almost half of them, were actually now moving into largely salaried work or self-employment.
Okay.
And fewer of them are actually remaining as casual wage workers. But of course, what you're seeing is, and this is actually something you see in a big picture for the Indian economy, people have been able to move out of this kind of highly informal casual wage work into salaried work. So
Hmm.
our
Yes.
growth has been in a way that it creates salaried jobs, and most people have been able to move out of agriculture. Okay, so that
Yes.
is, I think, something that can be more or less said for all identities in a sense.
Okay.
But for the scheduled caste or scheduled tribe worker, the movement out of agriculture has meant largely a movement into construction or into low paid services, so what we call traditional services,
Okay.
which is your
Yes.
street vending and retail trade and so on.
Got it.
Whereas for the general category and more privileged caste groups, the movement out of agriculture has been in the direction of modern services. So your financial services, real estate, businesses, and
Hmm.
so on. Right? So there is a movement out of agriculture, but then by identity they have this mediation in terms of caste. In terms of gender, how this has been mediated is that women have moved out of agriculture. But what that meant when the movement out of agriculture has meant that they completely exited from the
Yeah.
workforce. And this is a big story of the Indian economy that we've
Yeah.
had this declining female labor force
Yes.
participation rate. And in the case of religious groups, also you see this kind of the occupational mobility or the stickiness have been reduced, but to a lesser extent. So Muslim sons are still more likely to do what their fathers were doing. They have also been able to remain out of agriculture or work out of agriculture, but again, their access into high end manufacturing or modern services has been kind of stunted compared to Hindu households and Hindu children. But broadly, there is a exit from agriculture, movement into salaried work, but what kind of salaried work is varied by social identities.
Okay, so that is a great segue, I feel, because, like as you said, like one of the very positive developments that we see is that movement in away from casual work. There are more regular wage workers as a proportion of the workforce today, and this proportion of regular wage workers, which was I think hovering between like 14 to 16% between 83 and 2004, by 2017 it's up to around 23, 24%. Can you talk a little bit about what are the sources of these, which sectors are creating these regular wage jobs, and who are the prime beneficiaries or who have been able to access these jobs?
Yeah. So in the early, so post 1983 till around 2004 and 2000, even till 2011, most of the salaried job creation has actually come from actually public administration. So our government sector jobs in
Yeah.
a sense, right? That
Okay.
is who has been creating salaried work predominantly,
Mhm.
followed by services sector. So manufacturing typically does create salaried job, but in terms of its contribution to the total pool of salaried jobs, it's actually very small because
Yeah.
our manufacturing sector is quite small.
Okay.
So in 2004, 2017, you have this, you could say that annual job creation of salaried work was around 3 million. And what has happened now is that since 2004 onwards, the sector that is creating salaried job has changed. So what has happened is that it's no longer public administration and your defense services that is
Yeah.
creating salaried jobs, but rather it's your private sector. And
Mhm.
that private sector jobs are coming from health and education largely.
Okay.
So hospitals and schools and so on. So these kind of stuff,
Mhm.
sectors. So I think this also speaks actually another trend that you see is that alongside the decline in women in the workforce, if you look at just the salaried worker and the kind of dynamics within salaried workers, what you're seeing is most of the salaried job creation that has happened in more recent years,
Mhm.
the majority of those jobs have actually gone to women.
Okay.
So you have this slightly, maybe in a sense, initially looks contradictory that women are withdrawing, but at the same time, when women are employed, they
Mhm.
are getting your good salaried jobs. which
Okay.
speaks towards the kind of work that women desire and that can kind of incentivize them to come into work. Which is also the partly the reason why health and education has been major contributors, because those are the sectors that women tend to work in.
Yeah.
And so they are the ones that have seen the salaried worker increase, and so women have also been pulled into that kind of work as well.
Just to go back briefly to the question of social identities and labor market outcomes, we have seen like the workforce, the overall workforce in the country has its increase has been slightly it's not increased as much because of the increase in like younger people going into education and all of that. Is how important has that been in reducing this stickiness that you mentioned of social identities and employment opportunities in terms of like are we is education the reason why, one of the prime reasons why this is happening, and if people are educated, are they actually getting better jobs and more in the modern sector?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of broad, just sort of educational convergence, that so the access to education, you see that, and we have this very detailed report, I mean, analysis in the report on
Yeah,
educational convergence across jati groups,
yeah,
and
yeah.
that you see it consistently happening over time. So there has been increased access to education and almost equitable access to education. But unfortunately, I mean, so to some extent, yes, that has enabled, in a sense, the reduction in stickiness
Mhm.
and an upward mobility across generations.
True.
But two things to note is that, and something to which we don't directly address in the report, is that the returns to education, which is the increase in earnings as a result of being more educated,
Mhm.
has actually steadily fallen in India. So over time, if you are a graduate, being a graduate compared to being, say, a higher secondary individual, or compared to being illiterate, gave you an additional, let's say, 100 rupees.
Mhm.
But now, in more recent years, the increment in earnings because of your graduate degree has actually kind of, fallen.
Okay.
So more and more, the returns to education has fallen, which also points towards, you have a high pool of highly educated
Yeah, yeah,
people.
yeah, yeah.
And so the capacity for the economy to also to absorb all of those has been restricted, and so the returns to education is falling. The other thing that we also see is this very high unemployment rates amongst the highly
Yes,
educated.
yes.
So amongst graduates in general, about 15% unemployment rate, but
Okay.
more so if you look at the graduates who are below 25 years of age, the unemployment rate is about 42%, right? So there's this huge pool of individuals who are highly educated, potentially highly skilled, who are not able to get the jobs that they want.
Mhm.
So in a sense, while education has equipped our workforce, the economy maybe has not created the kind of jobs that can potentially absorb this highly educated workforce.
That's so true. It's like one of those worrying things where you see this like huge 40%, unemployment. And speaking of, like good jobs, we just spoke about the increase in proportion of regular wage work. But you also, as heartening as that is, you also point out in the report that within the sector of regular wage work, there are distinctions. You can have a regular salary job, but that job can be without any written contract, meaning that it is extremely precarious or without benefits. And in fact, what I found very interesting is that you do over the since 1983, you do this analysis where you point out, and it's said that the jobs that have a contract and have benefits both, that proportion has remained pretty much stagnant around like 5.1, 5.2% in the last 40 years. And like more and the most of the increase that we've seen in regular wage works is in the semi-formal and informal wage work. Can we point to any causes for this extremely skewed growth of the regular wage work in the country?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think something we don't fully explore. But I think one thing that one cause is, like I mentioned, the kind of industries that are creating salaried work, right? So
Mm-hmm.
previously it was your government jobs that were providing salaried work, and obviously that comes with maybe excessive amounts of security and benefits, one could argue. But serious, I mean, it is definitely, your highly formalized salaried work.
True.
And so the moment that employer changed, it's no longer the government that is providing, and rather it becomes a private sector.
Hmm.
You can then see that the private sector is obviously going to negotiate the degrees of formality that they will offer.
Yeah.
So it is, in a sense, an incentivizing tool. And when you have a pool of workforce who are highly educated and there's a shortage of jobs, then you're going to start playing around with these kind of incentives and amenities that you offer alongside your employment. When it's no longer mandatory. Right?
Yeah.
In many cases, having to provide social security benefits, maybe not PF, which now has a legal framework for it, but for some of the other social security benefits, there's no legal requirement. So
Hmm.
it's only reasonable to expect that the private sector is going to tamper with this, and that's what you see. So as more and more of salaried work is being created outside of the public sector, they are going to create increasingly, in a sense, informalized and casualized salaried work. And so you have these kind of fixed term employments
Yeah.
and other kind of contracts coming up as a result.
Like you mentioned the public sector, which was like a main source of like regular wage work, especially mostly for men. Like the difference, the fact that men have kind of lost out on this recent increase in regular wage work is largely, I think you would say that it's because of the loss of public sector jobs, and even whatever jobs there are in the public sector, they themselves are becoming more and more informalized in that sense that the government is
Yes.
letting them out.
Yeah.
That's the whole like trend towards contractualization, etc. Uh, I just I feel like I just want to address this question of structural transformation, which you like every I feel like every report begins with a kind of a brief, like a very detailed overview of what is the situation with structural transformation, and with in terms of employment, what you try to talk about is these two processes that are supposed to happen, I guess, in parallel. One, the change in the sectoral composition of employment away from agriculture, and then the terms of employment from moving away from casual wage work and self-employment to
Yeah.
regular wage work. Uh, the in the common like layperson understanding, those two processes I feel are people just equate it to like it has a linear relationship with output. More GDP grows, better jobs in the modern sector, etc., etc. So given the immense like output growth that has happened in the last 2 3 decades, how far along can we say, like are we as a country in that structural transformation process? Are we right in the middle of the curve? Are we lagging behind in some sense and like ahead in some others? What is the situation there?
To some extent, I think, I mean, as is the case with India, we tend to be these outliers. We tend to be a very large outlier.
Yeah.
Right. So the structural transformation process ideally should have been one that meant an exit from agriculture and a contraction of agriculture in terms of output. And yes, we are on track,
We
and
are
we
on
are
track.
very
Yeah.
much
Yeah.
in terms of similar countries at similar levels of GDP. But then what the other side of it is agriculture contracts, and your manufacturing should expand, and then your services should expand, right? Now, India has gone through this process of skipping the
Yeah.
manufacturing expansion. We've remained very, very, stable in terms of how much manufacturing contributes to output and how many they employ. But what has happened is that it's been a services-led growth. So that is why I say that it's an outlier. So we have gone to the whole process of transformation, skipping the manufacturing expansion, which would have then spurred an expansion of services.
Hmm.
We've been or we've had to have that kind of services expansion without an accompanying manufacturing expansion. So, in terms of the agri contraction, we are on track and we would be similar to other economies, but that is where the similarity kind of stops and it
Hmm.
ends there. But what we are really is, and this is a term called premature
Yeah. Yeah.
deindustrialization, which has been seen in other economies, and is other economies have been able to kind of have a services-led growth. So they've been
Hmm.
able to create jobs with the services economy,
Hmm.
where India has had limited success with that, and whatever success it has been more that it creates certain kinds of jobs for certain kinds of people.
Okay. Uh, the processes that I mentioned in the I think the technical term is the Kuznets and Lewis process.
Yes, yes.
I when I was reading through the report, I felt like this constantly kept thinking about, are these processes supposed to be descriptive in terms of they are describing the industrialization process that happened in, let's say, Western Europe, North America, and etc., or are they prescriptive in terms of like this is how so-called
Right.
developing countries ought to industrialize and shift
Yeah.
their workforce? Can you just explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, yeah. So just to clarify, so the Lewisian process would basically describes this movement away from traditional, in a sense, agriculture to modern services and
Yeah.
other kind of manufacturing thing. Whereas the Kuznets process talks about movement away from casual work and agriculture into sort of manufacturing. So they're similar in a sense,
Hmm.
and you're right that they are. I mean, I would say that they're descriptive and have become prescriptive. So the
Yeah.
idea is that this is how growth has happened for many economies. So the Lewis kind of starts with this dual economy framework. You have a very
Hmm.
traditional sector coexisting with the modern sector,
Hmm.
and what has happened and what they think should happen for a growing economy is that the traditional sector contracts and the modern sector kind of expands to a point where really there is no traditional sector. Everything in a sense becomes modernized.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
this has been the growth experience for a lot of the global north countries,
Yeah.
Europe and USA.
Yeah.
So that descriptive has become prescriptive to say that this should be the experience.
Hmm.
And so growth would on its own enable the withering away of agriculture, of casual work, and of informal economies. That
Hmm.
was not really the prescription that
Yeah.
came from that kind of, that kind of envisioning of economic growth. And so we are, in a sense, kind of contradicting that trend. So
Yes.
we've seen massive growth with a contraction of agriculture, but this creation of a parallel sort of informal economy and, in the sense, traditional economy, where you see extremely precarious, casualized work, but you also see a casualization of your formal and modern economy,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
what we
Yeah.
talk about in terms of your salaried work becoming
Yeah.
increasingly precarious.
Yeah.
And interestingly, this more casualization that you see, which is a sort of a reversal of your Lewisian trend, is
Exactly.
not now less and less not just a global south story. You
Yeah.
see this happening now in highly industrialized Western economies as well, where salaried work is becoming more and more scarce, and where there is salaried work, it is becoming without tenure, without a formal contract, and also, I mean, slightly dodgy arrangements.
Hmm. Hmm.
So your gig economy is a
Yeah.
classic feature. So that's your
True.
modern sector, but very casualized and precarious arrangements. So it's in that sense we're even the global north now seems to be approximating what's happening in the what has happened in the global south.
Yeah, I always found that there's this weird implication in in these processes that we talk about, is that we just assume that those economies just reach this state and that they're just not moving, that they're not changing, they're not evolving on their own, like they're having their own like processes and everything. And talking like just as a last thing that I want to talk about is with all these weird contradictory processes, these kind of paradoxical situations where on the one hand women are leaving the workforce, have left the workforce, but they're growing in regular wage works. There's a lot of, it feels a little bit confusing to just to try and predict the trajectory that will happen. And, so many different changes, as we saw with COVID also, like a lot of these processes are, a little bit reversible. The gains that you have made can be taken away if you're like, so in this extremely confusing environment, how do you see, in what directions do you see the labor market in India evolving over the next few years?
I don't. This is a tough one. And
Left
I
the
think as an
the
econ,
toughest question for the last.
yes, I saw that. And the thing is, I think I've been often, I think as an economist, and maybe because of the kind of areas that we work in, your natural tendency is towards doom and gloom, and to say, well, it's not looking good. So But I try and now resist that. I think there's a lot of good things to look to
That's
and
good.
maybe
Yeah.
some hope to live with.
Yeah.
But here's where the doom and gloom comes from. So I think
Hmm.
that if we are thinking of a business as usual scenario,
Yes.
where there is really no concerted effort to address things that are of worry, right?
Hmm.
And that's basically a huge pool of underemployed or unemployed workers, highly graduate workers who have aspirations for certain kinds of work, and an economy where the kind of jobs that are needed are not being created, right? So those are everybody know, I think it's
Yeah.
fairly common news now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, if there's no concerted effort to address at least one of these or all of them together,
Hmm.
it's not going to look pleasant.
Hmm.
Because a lot of what happens in this kind of situation is when you have high unemployment rates there, and especially in the social identity framework,
Yeah.
um, a lot of this kind of unfulfilled aspirations and dissatisfaction manifests through discontent, which is expressed through aversion or opposition to certain groups. And
Yep.
you see that both for women, you see that in the case of
That's true.
religion, you see that in the case of jatis. So that is really what we are seeing, the call for reservations, not just across social groups, but
Hmm.
across jatis, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And even states being apprehensive about migrant workforce. And all of
Yeah.
this is really a manifestation of an economic symptom rather than actually a social aberration.
Hmm.
So I think that unless there's efforts to address that, either a national employment framework
Hmm.
or a stimulation for a manufacturing industry, things are not looking great. And on top of that, we also have an aging workforce. So I think there is need to put in the social security system in place for the aging workforce while also enabling our the young workers to come in and build up savings and so that they can support themselves. So that's where I think that there is need for that policy. Otherwise, we are heading towards troubled waters. Now, on the good sort of, I think what I see in terms of positives
Hmm.
is that I think there is increasing recognition of certain problems.
Yeah.
So the for the example, the gender question
Hmm.
and the need to understand why women are withdrawing and what kind of jobs, what is the kind of infrastructure we should have. I think that's very nice to see that it's become a mainstream topic both in academics and policy making.
True.
It's not something that is on the sidelines. So I think that and I think there's a lot of initiatives at the state front, to some extent at the center front. So you have your various schemes, your transport schemes, which are kind of addressing this kind of a problem. So I think that is something good to look forward to. The other kind of positive that I also see is this recognition that on the data front, that we
Hmm.
need to have frequent data, we need to collect it from multiple sources. I think that is great. To the extent that you're not going to crowd out existing forms of data, but you only supplement existing forms of data. I think that's been a positive development as well. Um, yeah, I think there are these few things, and our educational story is also good.
Hmm.
But I think there's a lot to be worked on in terms of tertiary education and who gets access to that, because that's what is playing out really now in terms of who gets access to the best kinds of jobs as well. So I think there are good things that are happening and that can be built on.
Hmm.
But I think there's a fundamental big picture story which is fairly consistent in what it's telling us. And unless there's some concerted effort to address that, I would be worried about where we're headed as an economy.
One of the things that I mean, this has been known for a very long time, but like I was really kind of very shocked to see this that in the report you talk about this the correlation between I think it's called the elasticity, or employment elasticity,
Yeah.
and like the hilarious, you can say it's hilarious or it's just like really depressing, is that the relationship between employment growth and output growth is actually slightly negative. Like I think the coefficient is a point minus 0.11 or something like that with every
Yeah.
person. And that is, I guess, the what you were mentioning, the business as usual approach is that if you keep chasing that kind
Yeah.
of output growth and don't put in any concerted efforts, how are you going to provide employment to, like, all the people that are entering the workforce, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, so I think that's
Yeah.
a good sort of place to, like we need to do
Yeah.
something. Just recognizing that just pure output growth is not going to solve the
Yeah,
issues.
and I think it's fairly established now that at least in the Indian context, growth and employment have sort of decoupled, right?
Yeah,
They are
yeah,
moving in different ways, or
yeah.
not. One of them is not moving at all, and so just reliance on growth to further employment targets is not going to work.